Buried beneath the earth, he twisted in agony as her fear and pain tore through him. Trapped, he roared futilely as she whimpered his name, every instinct fighting against the paralysis of the sun that held his body safe in the soil as hers was tortured. Her soft mortal flesh so vulnerable to the hate of the Inquisition. Her every breath was labored in his ears as she struggled. He should never have come back for her. He had led the devils right to her door. Every cut of a blade or burning flesh, he felt with her. Bursting through the soil as the last rays of the sun slid from the sky, he shot out over the treetops, his enraged battle cry echoing out over the small town. The shutters and locks slamming into place as he landed, the cobblestones cracking under him, as his glowing eyes glared at the houses around him. Tonight he would break his promise. Tonight he would feast again on the blood of mortals, starting with those hiding on sanctified ground. Turning his back on the peasants that cowered in the dark of the homes, he approached the tall oak doors of the abbey. Her need for him beating against the insides of his skull, the beam locking the door closed, splintering with the force of his single blow. The robed men turning from their worship as he stepped forward, ignoring the burning of his feet as he crossed the blessed ground. "You will all die," he hissed, as the wind whipped around the simple church, the candles blowing out as his glowing eyes looked at each one of them, marking them for a painful death. Priests scattered in every direction, their fear not even coming close to the terror that sounded in her next cry. Frustrated, he let the priest run, leaping over the pews to land on the altar, the large cross hanging over the door that led to where they were keeping her, making his curse echo in the high beam ceiling. The pain shooting through his feet was nothing compared to the obstacle in front of him. In all of his hundreds of years, the cross, the symbol of his mortal faith, had been the bane of his damnation. Proof that he was as soulless as the legend said, a monster damned to hell. Proof until he met her, her soft blue eyes always twinkling as if she knew some marvelous secret that he did not. The light to his darkness, and she needed him. Stepping forward, resolved as he grasped the steel cross, the flesh of his hands contorting with pain as smoke started to escape out from between his fingers. Gritting against the agony, he pulled the cross free of the door, tossing it to the side, and with a yell as his burnt palms tore open. He ignored the priests that peered at him from their hiding spots. As he turned to open the door, the sound of her pain-filled scream making him forget everything else. With a howl of rage, he flew down the steps, ready to tear apart her tormentors, the stake flying across the small room, taking him completely by surprise as it pierced his heart. Stumbling backwards, he looked down at it, confused as he fell, his limbs stiff and unresponsive as the priest's dark hymn filled his vision. His rage beat against his own skull as the older man rolled him over to his back. Frustration filled him as the priest peeled back his lips to examine his fangs, his gloved finger tracing its length and outline before nodding, apparently pleased. At least 300 to 400 years old, he spoke over his shoulder, but it was her voice that answered, calm and confident. He claimed it was more like 500. Staring up at the old man's impressed face, he couldn't believe his ears nor his eyes as her beautiful, unmarked face appeared over the priest's shoulder. her light-filled eyes now cold and calculating as she stood looking down at him. Whistling, the priest smiled as his hands patted the vampire's face. "You are the best one yet." Glowing at the praise, her skin luminous in the candlelight, he couldn't help but stare. How was it possible? He had felt her pain and terror as close to his heart as if it had been his own. Yet she stood in front of him, not a dark hair out of place, a coy smile dancing at the edges of her mouth, proud of her betrayal. He had turned his back on his own kind, leaving them to fend for themselves while he had come for her. What a fool he had been. "Oh, don't look at me like that." Kneeling down, she held his wrist out so the priest could insert the copper tubing into his vein. Her eyes deliberately avoiding looking at the burnt mess his palms had become in his effort to reach her. "You're not the first vampire to be so easily fooled." Smiling, she smoothed his hair back from his eyes as his blood slowly started to fill the decanter. The glee on her face, as she stood watching it filling, cut him deeper than the stake buried into his chest. "It's amazing." Her sweet voice dropped low. "How much power just one sip of your blood will give us." Foolish girl, he would have gifted her with far more than a temporary stolen power rush. His blood more potent than she would ever know. He had been willing to turn his back on the dark powers that resided deep within him, to walk away from the dark delights, anything to have spent the rest of his life at her side. Even going so far as to weaken himself by feeding only on animals, to show her how he could change for her, his star, his light, his temptress, his betrayer. "You will all die." He forced the words through his lips, enjoying the spike of concern on her face as she turned to the priest. Should he be able to talk? Her voice was tight as she moved away from him. "He is older than the others that you've ensnared." The priest dipped his fingertip in the blood, spilling into the glass decanter, his eyes closing in pleasure as he tasted it. "With age comes power. Good for us, useless to him." They had no idea. Even he had forgotten how truly old he was. Watching the hurt confusion fade from his eyes, replaced with the coldness of 100 years of survival, she bit her lip. A habit that he had found endearing. A nervous reaction. Good to see that it hadn't all been an act. "Hurry it up." Her prompting came too late as he let himself fade into mist, dispersing around the stake that fell uselessly to the stone floor. Appearing behind the priest first, his burnt hands wrapping around the man's head, snapping his neck before dropping him to the floor, backing slowly up the stairs, her eyes wide, hands held up in front of her, warding him off as he turned and slowly followed. "Tell me again how powerful you are, my love," he asked, his voice a low hiss as she backed into the closed door. "I'm sorry." Catching her around the throat, he sank his fangs into her neck for the first time. seeing the long, borrowed years etched out in the memory of her blood. The faces of his fellow vampires, men like himself, helpless on the floor at her feet to feed her power, her youth. Draining her deeply, he lifted his blood-covered mouth from her skin, trailing a finger down her cheek as she looked up at him, her tear-filled blue eyes forever searing into his mind. Leaving her gently onto the floor, he ignored her raised hand as he stepped out, moving more out of instinct than skill as he deflected the feeble blow of a brave priest. Slamming the man into the altar, he snarled, "Do your worst, demon," the priest spat at him. "As you wish." Fangs flashing in the dark, the priest's scream was short-lived. Leaving the burning town behind him, he walked, his face bathed in moonlight as the smoke billowed around him. He was a creature of nightmares, of hell, more demon than man. Yet as he walked, he couldn't stop the tears of blood that rolled down his cheeks. Suddenly, you hear a knock at your door. Curious, you get up to investigate, and there shouldn't be anyone coming to see you at this hour. When you open the door, you're greeted by the face of a strangely pale man. He smiles when you open the door and asks, "My car has broken down a few miles back. May I come in and use your phone?" You smile and nod. You welcome him in. And as soon as you close the door, he pushes you back against the wall and gives you a sinister smile that reveals two perfectly sharpened fangs. You have just invited a vampire into your home. A grave mistake that can never be undone. Throughout the history of legend and storytelling tradition, there have appeared a particularly dangerous set of creatures that feed on the vital force of human beings. In modern day, they are known as vampires. Though there are many different legends of vampires that modern day perception can be traced back to, it appears that the first vampires were actually a form of revenants. A revenant was known to be a vile, undead creature that was driven to return to the earth because of the evil deeds that it had committed in its previous life, or because of the unfinished business. It was thought that the early vampires were a form of revenant that targeted their victims by attacking them and feasting on their blood. The original vampire was thought to be bloated in form and to have dark features, similar to what had been expected from a corpse in the early stages of decay. It was also believed that they often slept underground in coffins during the day, only to awake at night and wreak havoc upon the city. There were, however, ways to track down these vile creatures. One of the easiest ways was to search the cemetery for signs of holes above grave sites. These holes were thought to indicate the resting place of a vampire. Vampires are legendary creatures that prey on human beings by using their fangs to bite the throat of their victims and drinking their blood. There are almost as many different characteristics of vampires as there are vampire legends, but the main characteristic of vampires is that they drink human blood. They typically drain their victims' blood using their sharp fangs, killing them and turning them into vampires. In general, vampires hunt at night since sunlight weakens their powers. Some may have the ability to morph into a bat or a wolf. Vampires have super strength and often have a hypnotic, sensual effect on their victims. Because there is a long history of walking corpses and blood-sucking ghouls in folklore, it's difficult to pin down a distinct set of characteristics consistently attributed only to vampires. Central to vampire myth, however, is the consumption of human blood, or other essence such as bodily fluids or psychic energy, followed closely by the possession or sharp teeth or fangs with which to facilitate this task. In most depictions, vampires are undead, that is to say, having been somehow revived after death, and many are said to rise nightly from their graves or their coffins, often necessarily containing their native soil. Vampires are typically said to be of pale skin and range in appearance from grotesque to preternaturally beautiful, depending on the tale. Another frequently cited physical characteristic is the inability to cast a reflection or shadow, which often translates into an inability to be photographed or recorded on film. A person may become a vampire in a variety of ways, the most common of which is to be bitten by a vampire. Other methods include sorcery, committed suicide, or contagion, or having a cat jump over a person's corpse. Vampires are often said to have faster than normal healing capabilities, and they usually don't die of disease or other normal human afflictions. However, various methods for their destruction do exist. The most popular of those include a wooden stake through the heart, fire, decapitation, and exposure to sunlight. Vampires are often depicted as being repelled by garlic, running water, or Christian implements such as crucifixes or holy water. Like many other mythical creatures, it is hypothesized that these people with undiagnosable medical conditions were likely the inspiration of the vampire myth. But the fact is, only a vampire can create a vampire. So this tells us that vampires started with a single vampire who created others. But much like the chicken and the egg argument, we had little insight into how the first vampire came about until recently. The answer lies in the scriptures of Delhi, specifically the collection of writings known as the Vampire Bible. The first vampire started out as not a vampire at all, but as a human man named Ambrosio. He was an Italian adventurer who fate brought to Delphi in Greece. A series of blessings and curses transformed this young man into history's first vampire. It began with the sun god Apollo of Greek mythology, who in a fit of rage cursed Ambrosio so that his skin would burn should it ever touch sunlight again. Ambrosio's bad luck followed when he ended up gambling away his soul to Hades of Greek mythology, the god of the underworld. The next curse came from Apollo's sister, Artemis of Greek mythology, the goddess of the moon and hunting, who made it so that Ambrosio's skin would burn if he touched silver. The blessings came soon after when Artemis, taking pity on the poor young man, gave him the gift of immortality. He would carry his curses, his skin burning by sunlight or silver, but he would live forever in his current form. In the vampire original story, Ambrosio hunts swans and uses their blood as ink to write love poems to his lady, Selene. And this might be a bit creepy by our standards. It wasn't at all that unusual in ancient Greece to make do with what you hunted. Ambrosio later moved back to Italy, now as a full-fledged vampire. Legend traces him to the city of Florence, where he creates the first vampire clan. Not much is known about this clan, other than they were most likely willing human volunteers who wanted power and immortality, and they were willing to trade their souls for it. It was believed that the curse would continue for any vampire, where their souls would remain in the underworld, aka Hades, aka Hell, where they could return to claim them, but then they could never leave. From what we know of the history of vampires, the clan grew in size and strength until infighting created something of a civil war within the clan, and many vampires left to form their own clans. What happened to Ambrosio and those who stayed within him is largely unknown, though many believe that he still resides somewhere in Florence. The most famous vampire is, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula, though those looking for a historical, real Dracula often cite Romanian prince Vlad Tepes, 1431 to 1476, after whom Stoker is said to have modeled some aspects of his Dracula character. The characterization of Tepes as a vampire, however, is a distinctly Western one. In Romania, he is viewed not as a blood-drinking sadist, but as a national hero who defended his empire from the Ottoman Turks. The vampires most people are familiar with, such as Dracula, are revenants, human corpses that are said to return from the grave to harm the living. These vampires were Slavic origins, only a few hundred years old. But other, older versions of the vampire were not thought to be human at all, but instead supernatural, possibly demonic, entities that did not take human form. There are clear foundations for vampires in the ancient world, and it is impossible to prove when the myth first arose. There are suggestions that the vampire was born out of sorcery in ancient Egypt, a demon summoned into this world from another. There are many variations of vampires around the world. There are Asian vampires, such as the Chinese Shangxi, evil spirits that attack people and drain their life energy, the blood-drinking, wrathful deities that appear in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and many others. The best way to deal with vampires, of course, is to prevent them from coming back in the first place. A few centuries ago in Europe, this was often accomplished by staking suspected vampires in their graves. The idea was to physically pin the vampire to the earth, and the chest was chosen because it is the trunk of the body. This tradition was later reflected in popular fiction, depicting wooden stakes as dispatching vampires. There are no particular significance to using wood. According to folklore, vampires, like Jinn and many other magical creatures, they fear iron, so an iron bar would be even more effective than a wooden stake. Other traditional methods of killing vampires include decapitation and stuffing the severed head's mouth with garlic or a brick. In fact, suspected vampire graves have been found with just such signs. According to a 2012 Live Science article, the body of a woman was found in a mass grave on the Venetian island of Nuovo Lazaretto. Suspecting that she might be a vampire, a common folk belief at the time, gravediggers shoved a rock into her skull to prevent her from chewing through her shroud and infecting others with the plague. Other researchers later challenged this interpretation and suggested that the brick may not have been placed in the mouth after all, but instead was one of many bricks surrounding the body that merely fell there after burial. Whether that burial reflected an accused vampire or not, other graves are much clearer. In 2013, archaeologists in Bulgaria found 2 skeletons with iron rods through their chest. The pair are believed to have been accused vampires. Some traditions hold that vampires cannot even enter a home unless informally invited in. This may have been an early form of the modern stranger danger warnings to children, a scary reminder against inviting unknown people into your house. If your local villagers neglected to unearth and stake a suspected vampire and he or she has returned from the grave, there are steps that you can take to protect yourself. The exact method varies around the world, but in some traditions, the best way to stop a vampire is to carry a small bag of salt with you. If you are being chased, you need only to spill the salt on the ground or behind you, at which point the vampire is obligated to stop and count each and every grain before continuing the pursuit. And if you don't have salt handy, some say that any small granules would do, including birdseed or sand. Salt was often placed above and around doorways for the same reason. While most people can name several elements of vampire lore, there are no firmly established characteristics. Some vampires are said to be able to turn into bats or wolves, and others can't. Some are said to not cast a reflection, but others do. Holy water and sunlight are said to repel or kill some vampires, but not others. The one universal characteristic is the draining of a vital bodily fluid, typically blood. One of the reasons that vampires make such successful literary figures is that they have a rich and varied history and folklore. Writers can play with the rules while adding, subtracting, or changing them to fit whatever story that they have in mind. Finding a vampire is not always easy. According to one Romanian legend, you will need a 7-year-old boy and a white horse. The boy should be dressed in all white and placed upon the horse, and the pair set loose in a graveyard at midday. And watch the horse wander around, and whichever grave is nearest the horse when it stops is a vampire's grave. Or it might just be something edible nearby. Take your pick. Interest and belief in revenants surged in the Middle Ages in Europe, though in most modern stories, the classic way to become a vampire is to be bitten by one. That is a relatively new twist. In his book, Vampires, Burial and Death, Folklore and Reality, folklorist Paul Barber noted that centuries ago, often potential revenants can be identified at birth, usually by some abnormality, like some defect, as when a child is born with teeth. Similarly suspicious are children born with an extra nipple, in Romania, for example, with a lack of cartilage in their nose or a split lower lip, in Russia. When a child is born with a red claw or an amniotic membrane covering its head, this was regarded throughout much of Europe as a presumptive evidence that is destined to return from the dead, such as minor deformities were looked upon as evil omens of the time. The belief in vampires stem from superstition and mistaken assumptions about post-mortem decay. The first recorded accounts of vampires follow a consistent pattern. Some unexplained misfortune would befall a person, family, or town. Perhaps a drought, dried up crops, or an infectious disease struck. Before science could explain weather patterns or germ theory, any bad event for which there was not any obvious cause might be blamed on a vampire. Vampires were one easy answer to the old age question of why bad things happen to good people. Villagers combined their belief that something had cursed them with fear of the dead, and concluded that perhaps the recently deceased might be responsible, having come back from the graves with evil intent. Graves were unearthed, and surprised villagers often mistook ordinary decomposition process for supernatural phenomenon. For example, people might assume that a body would decompose immediately, but if the coffin is well sealed and buried in winter, putrefaction might be delayed by weeks or months. Intestinal decomposition creates bloating, which can force blood up into the mouth, making it look like a dead body has recently sucked blood. These processes are well understood by modern doctors and morticians, but in medieval Europe, these were taken as unmistakable signs that vampires were real and existed among them. Mercy Brown may rival Count Dracula as the most notorious vampire. Unlike Count Dracula, however, Mercy was a real person. She lived in Exeter, Rhode Island, and she was the daughter of George Brown, a farmer. After George lost many family members, including Mercy, in the late 1800s to tuberculosis, his community used Mercy as a scapegoat to explain their deaths. It was common at that time to blame several deaths in one family on the undead. The bodies of each dead family member were often exhumed and searched for signs of vampirism. When Mercy's body was exhumed and didn't display severe decay, not surprising since her body was placed in an above-ground vault during a New England winter, the townspeople accused her of being a vampire and making her family sick from her icy grave. They cut out her heart, they burned it, and then they fed the ashes to her sick brother. Perhaps not surprisingly, he died shortly after. And while there are many stories of vampires and vampire hunts all over Europe and the Caribbean, one of the best documented vampire stories that ever occurred was in Dillsboro, North Carolina, from 1788 to 1789. In the spring of 1788, a family arrived in the then small mountain community of Dillsboro, North Carolina. Their last name was Alford, and there were rumors that they were descended from royalty. They bought land down by the river and built what was then a very nice large colonial home. Mr. Alford opened up a doctor's office and a pharmacy and rooms in the front of the house, and people were at first really happy that a new doctor had arrived in their community. But very quickly, 2 different men who had went to the new doctor to be treated for gout died. Both men had been well liked by members of the community, and it really angered a lot of people. However, in a few months, the local minister had made a peace in the community, and for a time, everything seemed to be fine. However, the time of peace was short-lived. That fall, a young girl, child of the minister, was found dead in her bed with puncture marks to her throat. The minister's wife swore she had saw a dark form hovering over her daughter as she screamed, but it was too late and the child had died. This caused a huge uproar in the community, and the people of the area started to claim a vampire or a group of vampires were loose in their midst. Many nights, groups of men went out and searched, but they found nothing. However, some men claimed to have seen a large black bat-like creature fly over them. A few nights later, a young boy ran down the hill to his grandfather's house, and he told his grandfather something was up the hill in his daddy's house, attacking his mom and dad. The grandfather summoned other men, and they ran to his son's house up the hill, but the man, woman, and 2 girl children of 3 and 9 were dead with puncture wounds to their necks. The area was immediately in an uproar, and soldiers were called in and they searched the community. By February of 1789, things had quieted down when one evening screams were heard, and when the men arrived, they saw a black form of a human run from the house and run down the hill and into the Alford house. When the village men went into the house where the screams had come from, they had found the bodies of a young couple with vicious bite marks to their throats. Almost at once, more men came, and they were told that the murderer had ran down the hill and into the Alfort house. When the search party of men got to the Alfort house, Mr. Alfort refused to let him in. However, as soon as the sheriff arrived, they dragged Mr. Alfort outside and tied him to a tree. When the men entered the house, they found some strange things for sure. There were bedrooms upstairs with beds, but it was clear that no one slept in them. When the sheriff and search party got downstairs, they found 3 caskets, and Mrs. Alfort, dressed all in black, was in one of them, but very much alive. She hissed and cursed at him when she was pulled from the casket. Later that night, the sheriff and the village's minister announced to the crowd outside the Alfort house that the Alforts and their son were vampires. The Alforts were hung and then placed back inside the house that night. The house was set on fire and was burned to the ground. However, the couple's 15-year-old son was never found, and he was never seen in the area again. And there were no more vampire murders or unusual murders in the area. Were they really vampires? No one will ever know. But something very strange indeed had went on, and people at that time said that the Alforts were vampires. If the Alforts were not vampires, who was a vampire? Because something or someone was going around killing people and biting them on the neck. In terms of murder rates, New Orleans ranks among the highest. It has always been a notorious place for missing persons. That is, it is a place where people just disappear, and no one ever knows what happened to them. The blood of the French, Spanish, Indian, African, Creole, and English all mixed together here, where the mosquito is not so picky, nor perhaps are other creatures. Another legend tells about 2 brothers of New Orleans. They were said to be real-life vampires. John and Wayne Carter seemed to be normal in every aspect. They both had normal labor jobs down by the river, and they lived in the French Quarter. It was the 1930s during the Great Depression, and times were hard, so a man worked all he could. One day, a girl was reported to have escaped from the Carter brothers' apartments and run to the authorities. Her wrists were cut, not enough to cause immediate death, but enough to cause her blood to drain slowly over the next several days. The policemen ran to the Carters' 3rd-story apartment, and they found about 4 other people tied to chairs with their wrists sliced in the same fashion. Some had been there for many days. The story was that the brothers had abducted these people in order to drink their blood at the end of every day when they came home from work. Police also found about 14 dead bodies. The cops waited for the brothers to return, and when they did, it took 7 or 8 of them to hold down the 2 average-sized men. A few years later, when the Carters were finally executed, their bodies were placed in a New Orleans vault. Cemeteries in New Orleans are quite picturesque. Not only are they more ornate than the rest of the nations, but they combine many generations of one family inside one vault. The remains sift down into the bottom of the vault, and when it's all rubble, a new body is set inside. Many years after the Carter brothers' death, when they were placing another Carter in the family vault, they discovered the vault was completely empty. No John, no Wayne. They were gone. To this day, many sightings have occurred in the French Quarter that match the descriptions of these 2 brothers almost exactly. Years later, an owner of their apartment saw 2 figures that matched their description outside on the balcony, whispering to each other. Both figures jumped off the top of the 3rd-story balcony, and they took off running. The legend goes that if a vampire drinks your blood for 7 nights in a row, then only then can you become a vampire. Some of those found in the Carter's brothers' apartment had been there for more than 7 days. Here's a little bit of pop culture of vampires through the years. The most famous literary vampire has to be Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897. This is the original tale of Count Dracula. In contrast to the deformed, gruesome monsters of medieval folklore, Stoker created a seductive, wealthy, mysterious vampire. The novel deals heavily with themes of gender and sexuality. The Count lives with 3 seductive vampire women who feast on children and anyone who dares to enter the castle. When the character of Jonathan Harker succumbs to the vampire women, it represents a reversal of gender roles. Other female characters are said to represent sexual daring and intellectual ambitions. Since his debut in Stoker's novel, Count Dracula has appeared in countless film and television adaptations, with his name now synonymous with the word vampire itself. The late 20th century revival of vampire fiction is accredited to Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, which portrayed vampires as brooding creatures capable of emotion, with superhuman beauty, speed, and senses. The film, starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, was also a huge success. Rice's beautiful, misunderstood vampires paved the way for Stephenie Meyer's sparkling vegetarian family of the Twilight Saga, which debuted in 2006. The 4 Twilight novels and films embodied the peak of the 21st century teen vampire fever. Around the same time, series like The Vampire Diaries and other films like The Vampire Academy also enjoyed success. The modern incarnation of vampire myth seems to have stemmed largely from Gothic European literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, about the time of vampire hysteria was peaking in Europe. Vampires appeared in 18th century poetry, such as Heinrich August Ossenfelder's Der Vampir, about a vampire who seduces an innocent maiden. Vampire poems began appearing in English about the turn of the 19th century, such as Lord Byron's The Giaour, 1813. The first prose vampire story published in English is believed to be John Polidori's The Vampire, 1819, about a mysterious aristocrat who seduces young women, only to drain their blood and disappear. Dracula 1897 by Bram Stoker is one of the most important works of vampire fiction. The tale of the Transylvanian Count uses supernatural abilities, including mind control and shapeshifting, to prey upon innocent victims, inspired countless works thereafter. The novel itself is thought by some to have been inspired in part by 2 cruel people. The 15th century Prince Vlad III, Dracula of Transylvania, also known as the Impaler for his cruel methods of punishing his enemies, and Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Bathory was believed to have murdered young women during the 16th and 17th centuries in order to bathe in or possibly drink their blood so as to preserve her own vitality. By the mid-20th century, vampires began to be depicted as displaying a broader range of human characteristics. The popular American television soap opera, Dark Shadows, from 1966 to 71, featured a love-lorn vampire. In 1975, Fred Saberhagen published the Dracula tape, a retelling of Stoker's story from the misunderstood villain's point of view. Vampire fiction entered a new era, however, with the sympathetic portrayal by Anne Rice in her novel Interview with the Vampire, 1976. Rice's book introduced vampires that were brooding and self-loathing and squabbled like humans. Interview with a Vampire was highly popular and sparked a revival of vampire fiction that lasted into the 21st century, and subsequent vampire stories continued to use characteristics established by Rice. The vampire as a misunderstood romantic hero became popular in the later part of the 20th century, particularly in the United States. In 1991, Laurie Herder published Obsession, one of the first vampire novels to be categorized as romance, rather than science fiction, fantasy, or horror. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a television show in which the title character has a star-crossed romance with a vampire, aired from 1997 to 2003. Vampire romances also appeared in the steamy HBO television series True Blood, I loved it, which began in 2008 and is based on author Charlaine Harris's vampire series. Vampire romance for teens gained popularity at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, with books such as The Vampire Diaries, the series by L.J. Smith, and The Twilight Saga by Stephenie Meyer. I had to watch that over and over and over with my girls. The Twilight Saga, with its high school romance and vampires that sparkle in the sun rather than burst into flames, became a cultural sensation, ensuring a vampire trend for years to come. Here are legends of vampires from different cultures. The Striga, from Albania. The Striga is described as looking and acting like an ordinary woman, so that she can live among her victim unnoticed. According to High Albania, the Striga causes terrible pain in her victims by slowly draining them of blood. Ultimately, they shrivel and die. Only one thing can restore them: the Striga's saliva. Even if the victim had been killed, they could be resurrected if she was forced to spit in their mouth, but only if it was done before sundown. If the sun set while they were dead, nothing could bring them back to life. There is a way to ward off the Striga in Albanian folklore, but it isn't as easy to come by as garlic. When the Striga finished feeding off someone, she would have to vomit blood. If a person was able to follow her to her hiding spot after she had attacked, they could collect the regurgitated blood on a silver coin, and this would serve as a talisman that kept the Striga away. The Lugaroo, from the Caribbean. Like Varacalacus, the Caribbean vampire Lugaroo has a mythological link to werewolves. These shapeshifters appear to be ordinary human women, until they shed their skin like a snake. After dark, the Lugaroo peels off her skin to hunt. According to Michael Whelan's book, Sand, The Never-Ending Story, it wouldn't be difficult to see the Lugaroo coming. She flies around in search of potential victims, flames shooting from her armpits and orifices, leaving a luminous trail through the sky. This isn't the only form that the Lugaroo can transform into, which is how she gets into the homes of sleeping people. She takes on forms small enough to slip through any crack, and once inside, she drinks the blood of her victims. She has a weakness, however: compulsive counting. In order to prevent the Lugaroo from attacking, people leave a pile of sand outside their doors. Before she can go into the house to attack the inhabitants, she is compelled to count every single grain of sand. Since the Lugaroo must put her skin on by morning, people can be safe if they leave enough sand out for her to count. Draugr, Scandinavia. The Old Norse Draugr shares many attributes with Hollywood depictions of vampires, including the ability to heal their wounds and spread vampirism to humans, and they are also undead. According to the Universal Vampire, Origins and Evolutions of a Legend, people who were aggressive, sociopath, and violent in life might return to Draugr. Despite being dead and buried, their bodies do not decay, but they do change. The body becomes heavier and the skin becomes a very dark blue. The Draugr are depicted as hunting in the middle of winter, when it's coldest and darkest. They kill both livestock and humans, and they have a host of abilities to help them. Like the Strago, they are able to cause epidemics, and they are also able to curse individuals and cause insanity. When they need to escape, they can simply sink into the ground. The way to defeat a Draugr might be familiar as well. They must be decapitated and burned. Dyrgdu, Celtic. The Old Norse Draugr is believed to have been influenced by Celtic legends of ghostly and vampiric creatures, as noted by the Universal Vampire, Origins and Evolutions of a Legend. One of these undead creatures that may have diffused through mythology across cultures is the Dyrgdu. To humans, these revenants appear to be pale and beautiful women who just happen to be wandering through a graveyard at night. According to Teresa Bain's Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology, the Dyrgdu uses its beauty to lure men to the graveyard and kisses him, and then she bites. She exsanguinates her victim, draining his blood from his mouth. The blood-drinking Dyrgdu is undead, and according to legends, this can be the key to stopping this creature's deadly attacks. If the place that the Dyrgdu was buried can be discovered, and a cairn built on top, she will be trapped in her grave. The Asanbonsam from the Ivory Coast. The Asanbonsam looks almost exactly like a human, except for its hands and feet. At the end of its limbs are iron hooks. According to Teresa Bain's Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology, these creatures are ambush predators. They hide in trees just out of sight, waiting for an unsuspected human being to walk underneath. And when someone does, the Asanbonsam digs its iron hooks into them and drags them into the branches. And once they have captured the person, the creature bites them and drinks their blood, leaving a drained corpse behind. The Asanbonsam will leave the forest at night and sneak into houses, and when it finds a sleeping person, it bites their thumb and drinks enough to survive. To avoid being slowly drained in the night, people would regularly sacrifice goats, leaving enough blood on the ground to sustain the Asanbonsam. Cihuatateo, Mexico. Cihuatl is a Mother Earth goddess whose name was frequently called out during childbirth. The goddess of midwives and women who died while giving birth has a destructive aspect, however. They are Cihuatateo, described in Chicana sexuality and general cultural refiguring in literature, oral history, and art, as reproductive demons. The Cihuatateo are revenants. They are sometimes depicted as having been virgins in life, or those who died in childbirth. They wait at crossroads, and when a man passes by, they attempt to seduce him into adultery or other sexual transgressions. If a child comes to the crossroads, the Cihuatateo will hunt them. They also attack infants and pregnant women and women who have recently had children. The Cihuatateo stories are believed to have influenced the popular legend of the Weeping Woman, also known as the La Llorona, The La Llorona story has many variations, but often describes her as a woman who killed her own children and now wanders by the water, wailing in remorse. Adults in the southwestern United States tell this story to children to discourage them from going out after dark or being careless by the water. Jiangxi, China. While many vampires are supposed to be a human being who has returned from the dead, Jiangxi are different. Sometimes they are depicted as being the result of two souls in one body, like the dead Strigo. Unlike the Romanian belief, where this is an uncommon occurrence, this becomes from a belief that all people have two souls. According to Nigel Suckling's Vampires, the base malevolent soul builds up power in the body and eventually becomes vampiric, especially in moonlight. Other stories depict Jiangxi as demonic spirits that have taken advantage of a vacant human corpse and are able to control it. The Jiangxi has long claws, red staring eyes, and long pale hairs all over its body. The mention of this white or pale green hair was probably influenced by the appearance of grave mold. The smell of their breath is described as overwhelmingly toxic, and it might even kill those who breathe it in. They can fly, and they are far more stronger than human beings. The Jiangxi shares a weakness with the Caribbean Lugaru. If confronted with a pile of small things like seeds, the Jiangxi will be forced to count them before continuing to hunt. They can also be trapped inside a circle of rice. The creatures can be slowed down by beheading or driving a wooden stake through them, but the only way to ensure that they won't return is by burning them. Stickney, Seminole. The Stickney are part of the traditional beliefs of the Seminoles, stretching from the east coast of the United States to Oklahoma. According to Carol Rose's Giants, Monsters, and Dragons, an encyclopedia of folklore, legend, and myth, they are undetectable, looking exactly like humans until nightfall. And then they go to a secret place in the woods. They vomit up all their internal organs. Once they have done this, they transform, taking on the shape of an owl. They hunt by flying through the night, looking for sleeping people. Rather than biting them and drinking their blood, they suck their victim's heart out of their mouths. In order to transform back into their human form, they must return to their organs and swallow them. This can be the key to defeating the Stakini. However, if someone finds the organs in the woods before the Stakini is able to return and swallow them, the creature can be destroyed by using special arrows prepared with herbs and owl feathers. Forso, New Guinea. While there are a wide variety of vampires with startling appearances, the Forso of New Guinea is one of the few that can't be seen coming. According to Teresa Bain's Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology, the Forso is completely invisible, and rather than drinking blood, this creature feeds off the emotions, the life energy, and the sexual energy of their victims, leaving them feeling drained, leading to bad luck and even causing depression. They don't travel too far from their graves, but if anyone happens to come close, they will attack. The Forso can be kept away using prayers, but only if the Forso in question was religious in life. There is a way to stop them for good, but it's significantly different from the burning and beheading required of other vampires. The immortal Forso is considered a lonely soul looking for attention, and if people are willing to give it to him, the attacks might stop. First, the grave of the Forso must be discovered and its bones removed from the earth. They should be taken home and cared for, and this provides the Forso with the attention it needs, and it will not need to feed off others. Vampire, Russia. The vampire hides in plain sight like the Stakini, but they don't need to transform in order to hunt. They are indistinguishable from humans, except for the stingers hidden underneath their tongues. According to Global Legends and Lore, Vampires and Werewolves Around the World by Adelaide Bennett, the vampire isn't even restricted to hunting after dark, and instead chooses to search for victims during the day. And once they find one, they use their stingers to daze the chosen victims before draining them of blood. Like the Jiangshi, the only way to truly get rid of a vampire is by burning them. But that's just the beginning. As it is burned, the vampire's body explodes and hundreds of maggots and rats and insects pour out. If even one of those infected pests escaped without being killed by the would-be monster slayers, the vampire would live on and would come back to kill him. Acima, Brazil. The Acima is able to live side by side with ordinary humans. During the day, they appear to be elderly men or women, but at night, they transform into a glowing orb. Like the Luguru, these vampires are often depicted as shedding their human skin to reveal their true form. According to the Element Encyclopedia of Vampires, this blinding ball of light can be pale blue, red, deep aquamarine, or dark blue. The Acina hunts by flying through the sky, searching for its prey, sleeping humans. When they find one, they either transform back into their human form to drain them of their blood, or remain as a glowing orb to drain their energy. The pale blue Acina drains people slowly over time, so its victims are likely to survive their first attacks. The red, dark blue, and aquamarine varieties can be deadly in just a single night. If a human eats garlic, their blood becomes distasteful to the Acima. Like many other vampires, they are also compulsive counters, so piles of seeds might distract them. To ultimately destroy an Acima, however, their discarded human skin must be found and burned. There are many theories in the origin of vampires. We've discussed the mythological view, and here's the scientific theories. The belief in vampires stems from superstition and mistaken assumptions about postmortem decay. The first recorded accounts of vampires follow a consistent pattern. Some unexplained misfortune would befall a person, a family, a town, perhaps a drought dried up crops, or an infectious disease struck. Before science could explain weather patterns and germ theory, any bad event from which there was not any obvious cause might be blamed on a vampire. Vampires were one easy answer to the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people. In many respects, the vampire of today is far removed from its roots in Eastern European folklore. The first known reference to vampires appeared in written form in Old Russian, 1747, soon after Orthodox Christianity moved into Eastern Europe. The term for vampires was uber, which has uncertain origins, but it is possible literal meaning was the thing of the feast or sacrifice, referring to a potentially dangerous spiritual entity that people believed could appear at rituals for the dead. It was a euphemism used to avoid speaking the creature's name, and unfortunately, historians may never learn its real name, or even when beliefs about it started. The vampire served a function similar to that of many other demonic creatures in folklore and around the world. They were blamed for a variety of problems, but particularly disease, at a time when knowledge of bacteria and viruses didn't exist. Scholars have put forth several theories about various diseases' connections to vampires. It is likely that no one disease provides a simple, pure origin for vampire myths, since beliefs about vampires have changed over time. But two in particular show solid links. and one is rabies, whose name comes from a Latin term for madness. It's one of the oldest recognized diseases on the planet, transmissible from animals to humans and primarily spread through biting, an obvious reference to a classic vampire trait. There are other curious connections. One central symptom of the disease is hydrophobia, a fear of water. Painful muscle contractions in the esophagus lead rabies victims to avoid eating and drinking, or even swallowing their own saliva, which eventually causes what's been described as foaming of the mouth. In some folklore, vampires cannot cross running water without being carried or assisted in some way. As an extension of this system, furthermore, rabies can lead to a fear of light, altered sleep patterns, and increased aggression, elements of how vampires are described in a variety of folktales. The second disease is pellagra, caused by a dietary deficiency of niacin, vitamin B3, or the amino acid tryptophan. Often pellagra is brought on by diets high in corn products and alcohol. After Europeans landed in the Americas, they transported corn back to Europe, but they ignored a key step in preparing the corn by washing it and often using lime, a process called nixtamalization that can reduce the risk of pellagra. Pellagra causes the classic 4Ds: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. Some sufferers also experience high sensitivity to sunlight, described in some depictions of vampires, which leads to corpse-like skin. Multiple diseases show connections to folklore about vampires, but they can't necessarily explain how the myths actually began. Pellagra, for example, it didn't exist in Eastern Europe until the 18th century, centuries after the vampire beliefs had originally emerged. Both pellagra and rabies are important. However, because they were epidemic during a key period in vampire history, during this so-called Great Vampire Epidemic from roughly 1725 to 1755, vampire myths went viral across the continent. As disease spread in Eastern Europe, supernatural causes were often blamed, and vampire hysteria also spread throughout the region. Many people believed that vampires were the undead, people who lived on in some way after death, and that the vampire could be stopped by attacking its corpse. They carried out vampire burials, which could involve putting a stake through the corpse, covering the body in garlic, and a variety of other traditions that have been present in Slavic folklore for centuries. Meanwhile, Austrian and German soldiers fighting the Ottomans in the region witnessed this mass desecration of graves and returned home to Western Europe with stories of the vampire. But why did so much vampire hysteria spring up in the first place? Disease was a primary culprit, but a sort of perfect storm existed in Eastern Europe at the time. The era of the Great Vampire Epidemic was not just a period of disease, but one of political and religious upheaval as well. During the 18th century, Eastern Europe faced pressure from within and without as domestic and foreign powers exercised their control over the region, with local cultures often suppressed. Serbia, for example, was struggling between the Habsburg monarchy in Central Europe and the Ottomans. Poland was increasingly under foreign powers. Bulgaria was under Ottoman rule, and Russia was undergoing dramatic cultural change due to the policies of Tsar Peter the Great. The New England vampire panic was the reaction to an outbreak of tuberculosis in the 19th century throughout Rhode Island, eastern Connecticut, southern Massachusetts, Vermont, and other areas of New England states. Tuberculosis was thought to be caused by the deceased consuming the life of their surviving relatives. People thought burning the dead from disease in the 19th century and feeding their ashes to their sick family members would heal them, when in fact, it killed them too. This is somewhat analogous to today, as the world contends with the COVID-19 pandemic. Amid political change and uncertainty, perceived societal breakdown, whether real or imagined, can lead to a dramatic response in society. In conclusion, from scapegoat to romantic hero, vampires have inspired us for centuries in books, stories, legends, and movies. Vampires have been featured in folklore and fiction of various cultures for hundreds of years, predominantly in Europe. Although by the 20th century, vampires had largely become creatures of fantasy stories, urban myths about vampires continued to persist. As late as the early 20th century, some villages in Bulgaria still practiced corpse impaling. In the 1960s and 70s, a vampire was believed to haunt Highgate Cemetery in London. And in the early 21st century, rumors of vampires caused uproar in Malawi in England. They may be the best-known classic monsters of all. Most people associate vampires with Count Dracula, the legendary blood-sucking subject of Bram Stoker's epic novel, Dracula, which was published in 1897. But the history of vampires began long before Stoker was born. Creatures with vampiric characteristics have appeared at least as far back as ancient Greece, where stories were told of creatures that attack people in their sleep and drain their bodily fluids. Across cultures and continents, the power of vampire-like ghouls were blamed for phenomena that didn't yet have medical explanations for, such as the spread of disease during the Middle Ages, or what happens to the human body after death. The vampire is a misunderstood romantic hero, picked up steam in the later part of the 20th century, particularly in the United States. Creatures having characteristics of vampires have appeared at least as far back as ancient Greece, where stories were told of monsters that attacked people in their sleep and drained their bodily fluids. Tales of walking corpses that drank the blood of the living and spread plague flourished in medieval Europe in times of disease. Research from the 20th and 21st centuries has suggested that characteristics associated with vampires can be traced back to certain diseases that make one sensitive to sunlight and thin the skin and cause biting. Garlic, Bibles, crucifixes, rosaries, holy water, and mirrors have all been seen in various folkloric traditions as means of warding against or identifying vampires. Do what you will. Don a crucifix, ring your windows with garlic gardens, and sharpen your wooden stakes. It won't do any good. Vampires are here to stay. Though the original vampires are long since gone, their legacy remains, and vampires continue to fascinate the world. It seems likely that neither science nor wooden stakes will ever kill vampires.